Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Shadows Behind the Door. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves. As Grace stared out the living room window, the suburban street was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Her parents had left an hour ago, promising to return by midnight. This was the first time they had entrusted her to stay home alone, and Grace was determined not to let them down. Lock the doors, don't answer for anyone, and call Mrs. Hargrove next door if you need anything. Her mother had reminded her, her tone firm but caring. Grace had nodded, her 13-year-old mind torn between excitement and nervousness. Now, as the clock ticked toward 8 p.m., the initial thrill of independence was wearing thin. She paced the house, double-checking that the doors were locked and the windows latched. The faint hum of the television in the background was her only companion. Settling onto the couch, she flipped through channels, landing on a rerun of a sitcom. The canned laughter felt oddly hollow in the empty house. Grace tried to focus on the screen, but every little noise, creaks from the settling house, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows, made her glance over her shoulder. The knock came suddenly, loud and deliberate, shattering the silence. Grace froze, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, 3 sharp raps on the front door. Her stomach tightened as she approached the door, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a man standing on the porch. He was dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, the logo of a gas company embroidered on his shirt. In one hand, he held a clipboard. In the other, a toolbox dangled by his side. Grace hesitated. Her parents hadn't mentioned a gas company visit. "Hello?" she called through the door, her voice wavering slightly. The man smiled, his teeth white against the shadow of his scruffy beard. "Good evening, young lady. I'm here to check the gas lines in the area. Routine inspection. Are your parents home?" Grace's grip on the doorknob tightened. "No, they're not," she said cautiously. His smile faltered for just a moment before returning, this time with an edge of urgency. "That's all right. This won't take long. Just need to check a few things inside. Could you let me in?" I can't," Grace replied. "My parents aren't here, and I'm not supposed to let anyone in." The man's demeanor shifted. His polite facade slipped, replaced by a look Grace couldn't quite place. Something between frustration and determination. He leaned closer to the door. "Listen, kid, this is important. There could be a gas leak. You don't want to risk an explosion, do you?" Grace's pulse quickened. She shook her head and took a step back from the door. "I'm sorry. You'll have to come back later." The man didn't reply. Instead, his hand darted into his pocket, pulling out a box cutter. Grace's eyes widened in horror as he began slicing through the mesh of the screen door with quick, deliberate strokes. Panic surged through her. She slammed the main door shut, bolting it with trembling hands. The sound of the blade cutting through the screen was relentless, each rip sending a chill down her spine. She ran to the phone in the kitchen, her fingers fumbling as she dialed 911. Her voice shook as she whispered to the operator, explaining the situation. "Stay on the line," the operator instructed, her tone calm but firm. "Police are on their way." Grace hung up and darted down the hallway, her mind racing. Where could she hide? The man was still outside, but she could hear him muttering to himself, the words muffled but frantic. She bolted into her parents' bedroom and opened the closet. The smell of her mother's perfume mixed with the faint scent of mothballs. Her eyes landed on the hamper, overflowing with clothes. Without thinking, she climbed inside, pulling the lid over herself. Grace held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. From her hiding spot, she could hear the sound of the front door being forced open. The splintering crack of wood echoed through the house, followed by heavy footsteps. "Where are you?" the man called out, his voice low and menacing. He moved through the house methodically, his boots thudding against the floorboards. Grace could hear drawers being pulled open, furniture being shoved aside. He was searching for her. Every second felt like an eternity. The faint hum of the television still playing in the living room only made the silence in the bedroom more oppressive. Grace's breaths came shallow and quick, her hands gripping the edges of the hamper. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the terror. They grew louder, closer. Grace's heart soared with hope as she heard the man curse under his breath. The heavy footsteps retreated, and a loud crash followed. The intruder had fled out the back door. Moments later, Grace heard voices, officers shouting orders, the crackle of radios. It took a few more minutes before a knock came at the bedroom door. "Police! Is anyone in here?" Grace pushed the lid off the hamper and stumbled out, tears streaming down her face. An officer guided her out of the house, his reassuring presence grounding her as she recounted the events of the night. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the darkened windows of Grace's home as neighbors gathered in clusters along the sidewalk. Whispers filled the air, speculating on what had happened. Inside, Grace sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Her hands were shaking as she sipped water from a glass an officer had handed her. Her parents arrived minutes later, their faces pale with worry. Mrs. Hargrove had called them immediately after alerting the police. They rushed to embrace Grace, her mother sobbing into her hair. "We're so sorry, sweetheart," her father murmured, his voice thick with guilt. Officer Randall, the lead investigator, approached them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm demeanor that seemed to command authority. "We've secured the house and are continuing to sweep the area," he said. "Grace, you were very brave tonight. Your quick thinking probably saved your life." Grace nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't feel brave. She felt fragile, like a porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. As the officers conducted a thorough search of the house, the mood grew more tense. In the kitchen, they found items that the intruder had left behind: a coiled rope, duct tape, and a roll of black trash bags. The sight of these items made Grace's mother gasp and cling tighter to her daughter. Officer Randall frowned as he inspected the items. "This wasn't a random break-in," he muttered to his partner. He came prepared. In the attic, the discovery was even more disturbing. Officer Randall climbed up the creaky ladder with a flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the dusty space. Among the insulation and cobwebs, he found empty snack wrappers and water bottles. A small notebook lay discarded in a corner, its pages filled with erratic handwriting. The notebook contained disturbing observations about Grace and her family. The intruder had been watching them for weeks, documenting their routines and movements. There were even crude drawings of the house's layout and notes about potential entry points. Randall's stomach churned as he flipped through the pages. "This guy's been stalking them," he said grimly. "And he planned to do a lot worse than just break in." The officers quickly realized that the man had fled the scene before they could apprehend him. Despite the search, he had vanished into the night. Grace and her family were taken to a hotel for the night, but none of them could sleep. Her father sat by the window, staring out at the parking lot, while her mother clung to Grace as if letting go would mean losing her forever. "We should have been here," her father said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's not your fault," Grace whispered, but even as she said it, the fear lingered. The thought of the man still being out there, watching, waiting, was unbearable. The following morning, Officer Randall visited them at the hotel. He carried the notebook, its sinister contents now carefully bagged as evidence. "We found this in your attic," he explained, placing it on the table. "I need you to take a look and let me know if anything stands out to you." Grace's father flipped through the pages, his face growing paler with each entry. The man had written about their family dinners, Grace's school schedule, and even the nights they forgot to lock the back door. One line stood out: "Friday night. She'll be alone. Perfect opportunity." "That was last night," Grace's mother whispered, her voice trembling. Randall nodded. "He planned this. But what's more concerning is that he seemed familiar with your house. Do you recognize him from anywhere? A neighbor? A worker? Anyone?" They shook their heads, but Grace hesitated. "He said he was from the gas company," she murmured. "Could he have been pretending to be a worker?" "It's possible," Randall replied. "We'll be checking with the local gas company to see if they've had any workers in the area recently." Over the next few days, the police investigation intensified. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Mrs. Hargrove, who had called 911, provided a detailed description of the man. Tall, scruffy beard, wearing a gas company uniform. "Bless that woman," Grace's mother said, holding her hands tightly. But the discovery of surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera added a new layer of terror. The footage showed the man lurking outside Grace's house days before the break-in. He had been watching from the shadows, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. "He's been here before," Randall confirmed. "He knows this neighborhood." The footage also revealed something even more chilling. The man had tried to open the back door 2 nights earlier but had fled when the porch light came on. Even though the police assured the family that they were doing everything possible to find the man, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed sinister, every noise a potential threat. Her parents installed additional locks, cameras, and motion detectors. They even considered moving, but Grace knew the fear would follow her wherever she went. One evening, as she sat in her room trying to focus on homework, a notification from one of the newly installed cameras pinged her father's phone. He rushed to check it, his heart pounding. The footage showed a figure walking past their house, lingering just out of view of the porch light. The family didn't sleep that night, huddled together in the living room with every light in the house turned on. Randall and his team arrived to review the footage, but by the time they got there, the figure had disappeared. "He's taunting you," Randall said grimly, "but we'll catch him." For Grace, the nights grew longer, the fear more consuming. She began to dread the silence of her home, the feeling of being alone. She no longer watched television or listened to music. Every sound needed to be heard, every movement noticed. Days turned into weeks as the investigation continued. The police tracked down the uniform supplier used by the gas company and identified a man who had recently purchased a similar outfit. His name was Carl Lyman, a drifter with a history of breaking and entering. "We're close to finding him," Randall assured the family. But even with the name, the man remained elusive. The family's relief turned to dread when one of the officers informed them that Lyman had a history of hiding in attics, waiting for his victims to return home. "He's done this before," the officer said, "and he doesn't stop until he's caught." The family remained on edge, their home feeling more like a prison than a sanctuary. Grace began sleeping in her parents' room, unable to face the darkness of her own. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent their hearts racing. The presence of the intruder lingered, an invisible shadow that refused to be banished. Grace's life settled into an uneasy rhythm in the weeks following the break-in. Though the police assured her family that they were closing in on Carl Lyman, the uncertainty gnawed at her. Every creak of the house, every distant knock, sent her heart racing. She stopped sleeping in her room entirely, her sanctuary now a source of terror. Her parents remained vigilant. Cameras covered every angle of the house, and locks were checked obsessively. Yet, the sense of safety remained elusive. They lived in constant anticipation of a knock at the door, a shadow passing by the window, a noise in the attic. One night, Grace awoke to the sound of her father's urgent voice downstairs. She crept out of bed to find him speaking with Officer Randall on the phone. "We got a lead," he said as he hung up, his face a mixture of relief and tension. Carl Lyman had been spotted in a neighboring town. A clerk at a hardware store had recognized him from the police bulletin and called it in. Lyman had purchased rope, duct tape, and a crowbar, items chillingly similar to those left in Grace's home. The police closed in on his last known location, a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Officer Randall led the charge, his team surrounding the building in the dead of night. They burst into the room, but Lyman was gone. A broken window at the back of the motel told them he had fled. Left behind was another notebook, filled with details about his movements since the night of the break-in. The final entry read, "I'll finish what I started." The cryptic message sent chills down Officer Randall's spine. It wasn't just a taunt, it was a promise. Lyman wasn't finished with Grace's family, and he was determined to come back. Randall called the Hargroves immediately, urging them to leave the house and stay in a safe location until Lyman was apprehended. But Mr. Hargrove refused. "We're not running from this," he said firmly. "This is our home." Reluctantly, the police stationed officers outside the house and patrolled the neighborhood. Grace felt trapped in a nightmare that refused to end. It was a stormy evening when the nightmare reached its climax. The rain pounded against the windows, and thunder rattled the walls. Grace was in the living room with her parents, the television muted as they listened to the storm. A sudden noise, a faint creak from above, froze them in place. Her father grabbed the flashlight and gestured for everyone to stay put. He crept toward the attic ladder, his heart hammering in his chest. "Be careful," Grace's mother whispered. As he reached the ladder, the creaking grew louder, followed by a faint scuffling sound. Mustering his courage, he climbed the rungs slowly, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lyman was crouched in the corner, his face twisted into a maniacal grin. "Looking for me?" Lyman growled, lunging forward. "Mr. Hargrove shouted, the commotion drawing Grace and her mother to the scene. Lyman and Mr. Hargrove grappled, their struggle shaking the fragile attic beams. Grace's mother screamed and ran to call the police, while Grace stood frozen at the base of the ladder. "Run, Grace!" her father yelled. But Grace didn't run. Instead, she grabbed the heaviest object within reach, a fire poker from the fireplace, and climbed up after her father. Adrenaline overpowered her fear as she swung the poker at Lyman, striking him in the shoulder. Lyman howled in pain, losing his grip on Mr. Hargrove. The distraction was enough for her father to push Lyman back, sending him crashing into the attic floor. "Stay down," Grace yelled, her voice trembling but resolute. The sound of sirens grew louder, and moments later, the police stormed into the house. Lyman was apprehended, his face bloodied but defiant. The aftermath was a blur of police reports and media attention. Lyman's arrest brought relief but not closure. Grace and her family knew that the scars of that night would linger long after the cameras stopped flashing. During his trial, the extent of Lyman's crimes came to light. He had a history of stalking and breaking into homes, but his obsession with Grace was unprecedented. His notebooks revealed a twisted mind, fixated on control and terror. Grace testified in court, her voice steady despite the fear that churned inside her. "You don't control me," she said, meeting Lyman's cold gaze. "Not anymore." Months turned into years, and the Hargroves slowly rebuilt their lives. Grace carried the weight of the ordeal with her, but she refused to let it define her. She channeled her experience into advocacy, speaking at schools and community centers about safety and resilience. The house that once felt like a prison became a symbol of her strength. She returned to her room, no longer afraid of the shadows. One evening, as she stood by the window looking out at the quiet street, her mother joined her. "You're stronger than you know," her mother said, wrapping an arm around her. Grace smiled faintly. "I don't feel strong sometimes." "That's what makes you strong," her mother replied. The story of Carl Lyman faded from the headlines, but Grace's story remained a beacon of hope for others. She had faced unimaginable fear and come out the other side. And though the shadows still lingered, they no longer held the same power. Grace had reclaimed her life, proving that courage wasn't the absence of fear but the decision to face it head-on.